Hey guys, this is Dr. Mitch. Let's pick up the drug prevention lecture here. The sample items include this first one. The best drug prevention programs have A, empirical support, B, an authoritative style, C, physiological components, or D, free samples. Well, I hope after the weeks we've spent together, you know I would go for empirical support. Truth be told, an authoritative style isn't terrible. It's the authoritarian style that would be terrible, but we don't have any data on that. Physiological components, we don't really have any data on that either from drug prevention, except in really small samples. And obviously, free samples does not sound like a good way to prevent drug problems. A prevention program is more likely to succeed if it has A, recovered addict presenting, B, a law enforcement component, C, an interactive presenter, or D, free samples. And I hope you would pick an interactive presenter. I actually had a recovered addict come to my high school back in the day. We don't have any data on whether that matters or not. I think some of them are sure really great persuasive presenters, but we just don't know. A law enforcement component, again, the fact that police officers ended up in the DARE program was not part of the original plan, and we haven't randomly assigned folks to one condition or another with law enforcement being part of the material that you study. So again, we just don't know. An interactive presenter is a big plus. So anybody who can go back and forth with the folks who are participating, that goes a long way. And as I mentioned, free samples, not a great idea for preventing drug problems. Although we don't have the data, so who knows? So we're picking up on more key elements of the effective school-based programs. Adequate coverage of material and follow-up. Well, unfortunately, we don't really know what adequate is, but generally, if the students have questions, you got to be able to answer them or at least point them in the direction of a place where they could get an answer. And I have heard some wild things in my day going to high schools both around here and in Los Angeles. And I was grateful that I had taught this class because, man, there's some wild stories out there. Follow up, just literally getting a chance to go and check on the folks after the program, not only to gather data, but to maybe have a little booster session, just kind of remind folks that this was a priority in their lives at one time or another. Culturally sensitive strategies. Unfortunately, what I've seen done on this is really kind of embarrassing. So the Native American focused one, starts talking about the Great Spirit and tobacco and stuff, and just really seems kind of obtuse. I was disheartened to see what had been done, and I think they need to, obviously get input from the culture they're meaning to talk to, rather than just sort of make these weird assumptions. I'm stunned at what's passing for culturally sensitive psychotherapy lately too. So these books filled with ridiculous stereotypes about oh religious groups or different cultures, and then they say this is how culture X really values family and food. Like, duh, which culture doesn't? So I'm not thrilled with how these are done. Although I like the spirit of it, seems like it ought to make sense to adapt things to different groups. But the tacit assumption is that everybody at that location has that same identity, and often that is faulty as well. Broadening school-based activities to include families, community, etc. There are data in support of this, and I got to admit, I was pretty skeptical. I thought of dragging my parents into a school-based activity to prevent drug use. Makes me makes me want to guffaw. But at least some families and some communities, it really does seem to help. And part of it is the life skills. So training everybody in relaxation training, training everybody in assertive request. If your whole family knew how to talk to each other nicely instead of kitchen sinking or criticizing, wow, wouldn't that be great? And then finally, methods of evaluation. The hope is that there can be some anonymous survey, if not bogus pipeline, which we'll get into, but some way to get a feel for not only drug use but drug problems in the participants. That's going to go a long way. So I don't want to beat a dead course, with the DARE program, it still looms large, and I just want to emphasize that it is not as dumb as it sounds when you initially see the proposal. It just kind of got legs of its own and turned into this monster that really not only didn't help, but at least in a couple of upper class samples, made kids more likely to use drugs. It did suggest that folks who'd been in the DARE program liked law enforcement officers better, so maybe something good about that. But we're not seeing decreases in drug use or drug problems as a result. The 10-year follow-up paper was so biting, just really scathing. But I think to think that something you do in high school should have an impact 10 years later is a real outrageous expectation, right? Let's just try to get folks through high school without ending up inpatient for drug treatment. That would be a reasonable goal, not 10 years later they've never done a drug. Yeesh, that's a little too much. So yeah, it did start in LA. Don't drive yourself nuts with any of these dates. And after it had some initial runs, it went from what was supposed to be have a cool high school kid come down to the junior high and talk to students about drugs in an interactive way. Somebody got the bright idea to have law enforcement do it instead, and law enforcement really liked it. It's got to be more fun than fingerprinting people for a dime bag, right? So it really did not have any empirical support when it became part of the Improving Schools Act in the 90s. By 96, Clinton was like, oh, and we've got this great new program. We had data by then suggesting it probably wasn't very good. And in fact, 2 years later, NIJ said, hey, this is not doing anything. The school where my daughters went, they went to Hebrew Academy, and they had it there. And I just went to the principal and said, this is ridiculous, right? And he was like, shh, the law enforcement folks really like to do it, and we want to have them on our side. And I was like, I totally get you. I want to have law enforcement on my side too, right? But it was a total waste of time. And then, at Slingerlands Elementary, my daughter won the DARE competition for the essay, and I think she still has a little lion or something for it. So, yes, the irony is a little thick. So, unfortunately, DARE is part of the war on drugs, and we'll get into this more when we do the cannabis section of the class. But the war on drugs, you would think, was actually a war on drugs. I have not seen any bags of cocaine in jail or anything like that. It's actually a war on some drugs, and mostly a war on some drug users. I hate the war metaphor. Later on, some of the drug czars at least went for it's a cancer and we can cut it out or something like that. Ugh. How about just saying it's a health problem? We've already got some good metaphors for that. It was an international education program. It really caught on big. It's embarrassing in hindsight, and the most widely used of all programs. By the end of the 90s, people were starting to question it at least, but there was a time when it was in literally almost every public high school around, and those hours could have been spent learning statistics or something that would actually help you in life. So I'm not thrilled with this one. So obviously the goals did include humanizing police, allow students to see officers in a helping role, open lines of communication between law enforcement and use, and have officers as educators. Well, why were these the goals? I didn't realize. Now, I will be the first to admit there are some neighborhoods where the relations between high school students and law enforcement are not good. I grew up in one, but it doesn't seem to be a big enough problem to spend millions of dollars on and have a lot of educational time devoted to it. It didn't really make any sense. If this is really the problem, why not just have law enforcement come in and hang out with the kids and talk about anything? Talk about their lives, talk about how they became law enforcement officers, talk about how they have similarities with the people they're sitting there with. We've already got data to suggest that that's much more convincing. So the hope was they're going to provide students with skills and knowledge to avoid substance use and abuse and violence and gang involvement. And as soon as that got added too, it's like, okay, we're making it broader and broader. Now the program has to cover more. And of course, it's going to have a harder time trying to do two goals rather than one. The violence and gang involvement interventions are actually pretty decent and usually focus on problem solving, assertive declines, like when your troublemaking buddies come and say, "Hey, hop in the car that they just stole," and things like that. So it's a very different focus. It's not that there's no overlap, and then the knowledge portion of substance use and abuse, as we've seen, doesn't really help much. So this ended up turning into this, go make a public commitment, say drug free for me, and stand up front of the class and things like that. It wasn't completely incomprehensible given some of the social psych theories we have. It just did not pan out. So it was a 10-week in school program. The police officer led a series. Apparently, some folks went in kindergarten. So I actually had a cop come to my grade school who did magic tricks and stuff and basically scared the hell out of us. Um, you never know why you'd go quite that far down. And then those individuals who chose to lead the sessions were specially trained. So at least they didn't just say, "Hey, officer so and so, go in and tell them about drugs." Although I'd certainly heard some tangential stories, not that I can point any fingers at anybody for telling tangential stories. So literally, we ended up with Dare America, this national nonprofit. And although it was a nonprofit, believe me, the people in charge got paid. And it was a resource to communities, helping them establish and improve local Dare programs. So it provided officer training, paid for some of the posters and the advertisements and things like that. People went in and made, I think, some pretty outrageous claims for what it could do to get the schools to spend the money. And then, if you were on a school district board and voted against it, then you looked like you were some kind of pothead or something. And then as the national awareness for DARE increased, what a surprise, everybody felt like they had to do it, when in fact, there was no need to, given the data we had by 96. So what were the criticisms? Definitely ineffective. So rarely do we see a positive impact? And when you do, you read the paper closely and you find out, they measured 11 things and one thing turned out okay. And we have no idea if they really did a good job controlling their stats for chance. We did see the opposite effect, particularly in upper class neighborhoods, which kind of surprised me. So folks who'd had DARE in the upper classes and basically who had the spending money ended up being more likely to use intranasal cocaine in one study, for example. There was definitely no proof, and DARE's research was not good. So the research really did not go well. So how did it turn out? Well, mixed results throughout the literature. I would say that's a little optimistic even. We did learn a bit about teaching styles and approach. Finally started manipulating instructor type and found that the teacher was probably just as good, if not better, than having a police officer. The long-term versus short-term results, well, we were expecting too much. To have a 10-year follow-up from something like this is just a little too much. And the perceptions, unfortunately, really lagged the data, and we see that a lot. What is the deal with perceptions of DARE? Everybody had heard of it, assumed it was good, when in fact it really was not. So as an alternative, I want to get into what's called life skills training. And my friend Steve Sussman has one called Project Towards No Drug Abuse, right? They're all pretty much overlapping with some of these skills. And these all have some empirical support. They've got some developmentally appropriate contact, both in basically in elementary and in middle and in high school. It does help develop skills and confidence. The confidence measures, I think, are a little corny, but you definitely can see behaviorally that folks learn how to do these things. And it does reduce risk of substance abuse and some use. So the number who start ever smoking a cigarette, for example, is definitely down. And then the drug problems long term definitely seems to go down. While we're thinking about, we should think about sort of who is at risk. And it turns out we've got some splendid buffers related to religiosity. So if you're identifying with an organized religion, or you attend church, or even if you just pray a lot, apparently that's a buffer. And then the high risk things include boredom and spending money. So if you've got the cash, you may be at risk. And if you're bored a lot, the idle hands are the devil's workshop, as my friends at the Satanic Temple tell me. So what was the focus on the life skills training? Well, skills to cope with peer pressure, right? This tacit assumption that peer pressure is what gets folks to do drugs is kind of a thing that parents can handle. So, oh, it's not my kid, it's your shit kid is making my kid do it. But the skills actually do generalize to some of the assertiveness skills. So saying no to do you want to do drugs can generalize to do you want to have sex when you don't want to? Do you want to skip class? All these other maladaptive decisions that might uh, not be helpful. So it does improve self-esteem and confidence. Again, I do make fun of those measures, but essentially once you've got these social skills in particular, you do feel better just about having to go to school. I mean, let's be honest, high school sucks. Like, ugh. So it's good to be able to at least get through it. Coping with anxiety effectively. So it's been stellar that learning progressive muscle relaxation, they learn some cognitive reframing, things we'll get into when we do the psychiatric meds, but basically how to decrease general arousal. And I would add some depression things too. So they're really big on scheduling pleasant activities, making sure you have fun in your day, getting out and getting some exercise, and all those are great emotion regulation strategies. Teaches immediate consequences of substance abuse. The first draft, I thought, leaned a little too heavily on legal sanction because, truth be told, nobody thinks, especially when they're a teenager, they're going to get arrested or get in trouble with the law. But the immediate consequences of respiratory irritation, poor performance in sports, poor performance in school, things like that, that's good. And then enhanced behavioral and cognitive competence. Well, if you learn how to solve problems well, and learn how to basically interact socially well, that's going to pay off even if you do, God forbid, try a drug once. And then what were the components? Well, drug resistance skills, literally just broken record technique for declining. So you guys probably haven't seen a record, so that expression is ridiculous. But if you had a scratched record back in the 70s, it would skip. It would do the same point over and over again. And that was what basically they were taught for drug resistance skills. So you're supposed to look the person in the eye and say, no, I'm not interested, and then suggest an alternative activity, right? So, hey, Mitch, you want to smoke some pot? And then I would say, nope, but let's go get a banana split, right? Bottom line being, then if they'd say, oh, come on, mommy won't let you, and I would say, nope, sure would like to go get a banana split. And they'd say, Mitch, this pot's going to make that banana split taste really great. And I would say, nope, let's just go get the banana split. Right? So that broken record technique was part of the drug resistance skills. And then other assertiveness, putting assertive requests in an acknowledgement sandwich. So you thank the person, acknowledge them, state the problem using I statements, suggest an alternative, and then thank them again. Those kinds of things really go a long way. The personal self-management skills, and it's funny because these seem so far away from dealing with drugs, but usually included some kind of time management, right? So literally make a list of what you need to do and what assignments are due and when is soccer practice and when do you have to go to the orthodontist and all these kinds of things. And sort of having your own life laid out and then getting you in touch with your own values so that you could prioritize. So, okay, well, I can watch a half hour TV, but then I got to do my calculus, right? Whatever it is. And it's startling how They were doing these in middle school by the time my kids were in there, and it really does seem to help. And I assure you, nobody taught me that stuff. And then the general social skills, the assertiveness I mentioned, but even just, how do you meet new people? How do you ask open-ended questions? How do you have nice interactions? How do you handle conflict? And those things really do add up. And it was also a 12-week thing, and it was led by, if they could get them, a hipster, like, I guess hipster doesn't mean this anymore, a college student who seemed cool, who usually worked in the lab or the company that was doing this. And then, yes, it was definitely proven effective in white middle class students, but also, uh, at least around Los Angeles, to some of the ethnic minority students, then some inner city urban populations, suburban populations. So in Missouri and Texas, some really intriguing suburbs, but also the control cities that were definitely rural, responded to essentially the same program, although from what I heard in the Ozarks at least, some of the expressions and things made them laugh. So I got a kick out of that. Well, so I'll get into some of the implementation, but go ahead and get yourself a break and write yourself a question or two and outline any notes you might have. Dance around if you need to, listen to some music, and we'll be right back with Drug Prevention 3.